I welcome you to my channel. Subscribe and listen to my new stories every day. I sat there at the kitchen counter, watching Laura as she cheerfully poured herself a cup of coffee. Her hair was tied up in a messy bun, the loose strands falling around her face in that way that used to drive me crazy. It was Friday morning, the beginning of our usual weekend routine, except something was off. Laura wasn't rushing to get the kids ready or glancing at her watch in that impatient way of hers. Instead, she was relaxed, like she had all the time in the world. Then, almost casually, she dropped the bomb. "I'm going out tonight with some friends. Probably won't be back until morning." I stared at her, trying to keep my face neutral. It wasn't just the words that unsettled me but the way she said them. Calm, practiced, like she'd rehearsed it in her mind a few times already. We'd been married for 11 years, and I knew Laura well enough to tell when she was lying. The small twitch in her left eyebrow, the way her eyes flickered just a bit to the side, all the subtle signs were there. "Really?" I asked, doing my best to sound disinterested. "Anything special going on?" "Just some work friends," she replied with a nonchalant shrug, taking a sip of her coffee. "It's been a rough week, and we all thought a little unwinding wouldn't hurt." She flashed me a quick smile, as if that would be enough to brush off any suspicion. I nodded, masking my disappointment. In the back of my mind, memories of her recent late nights and sudden, work emergencies, surfaced, little flashes of moments that had chipped away at my trust bit by bit. I'd ignored them, brushing them off as paranoia or just typical work stress. After all, Laura had always been dedicated to her job, and it wasn't unusual for her to have late meetings or business dinners. But lately, her absences had become frequent enough to raise questions. And now this, an entire night out. As she left the kitchen to get ready for the day, I stared at my coffee, my stomach twisting in knots. I'd seen friends go through the nightmare of betrayal, and I'd always pitied them, confident that Laura and I were immune to that kind of breakdown. We had built something solid, a life that was supposed to be unbreakable. Or so I thought. The day dragged on. I went through the motions at work, hardly able to concentrate. The whole time, I kept replaying our conversation in my head, wondering if I was reading too much into it. Was it just a friendly night out, or was there something more? My logical side told me I was being irrational, but my gut wouldn't let it go. Later that evening, when I got home, Laura was already dressed and ready to go. She looked stunning, wearing a black dress that hugged her curves perfectly, a look she usually reserved for our date nights. My suspicion flared again, but I kept my mouth shut, hoping I was wrong. "Have fun," I said, keeping my tone light. She leaned in, planting a quick kiss on my cheek. "Thanks. I'll see you tomorrow." And then she was gone, leaving me standing alone in our living room, staring at the door. I waited until I heard her car pull out of the driveway before I made my way to the bedroom. Her side of the closet was neatly organized, but I noticed a small bag was missing, the overnight bag she usually took on business trips. My heart sank. I sat down on the edge of the bed, the weight of realization settling over me. If she was going to be with friends, why would she need an overnight bag? My mind churned with possibilities, each one worse than the last. The evidence was circumstantial, yet it gnawed at me with a growing certainty. I spent the evening in a daze, replaying moments from the past few months. Little things that had seemed harmless at the time took on a new meaning. The secretive texts, the late-night work calls, the sudden need to work out more. I'd told myself it was just work stress or midlife jitters, that we were both so busy with our careers and kids that we hadn't had the time to reconnect. But now, sitting in our quiet bedroom, the truth was harder to ignore. When I couldn't stand it any longer, I grabbed my laptop and opened our cell phone account. We shared a family plan, and I quickly navigated to the call logs, something I'd never done before. I knew it was a breach of trust, but given the circumstances, it felt justified. I scrolled through the list, looking for any patterns. And there it was. A number I didn't recognize, one that appeared multiple times a day, especially late at night. The area code wasn't local, and each call lasted several minutes. My blood ran cold as I realized this was likely the person she was with tonight. For a moment, I considered calling the number. What would I even say? But something stopped me. I wanted proof, undeniable evidence that I could confront her with. Jumping to conclusions without concrete answers would only create more tension, maybe even push her further away if I was wrong. I closed the laptop, my hands shaking. I'd always trusted Laura, even during tough times. We'd built a life together, had children, created a world that I thought was ours alone. But now, it felt like a part of that world had been ripped away, replaced by a dark unknown. I decided then that I would wait. If she was hiding something, I would find out the truth. Rushing into confrontation without a plan would only end in disaster, and I wasn't ready for that, yet. The next morning, Laura came home around 10, looking tired but cheerful, like she'd just had the time of her life. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping my coffee, pretending to read the news on my phone. She leaned down, kissed me on the cheek, and muttered something about needing a shower. I watched her go, a knot forming in my stomach. She didn't look guilty or nervous, just content. It was enough to make me question myself, to wonder if maybe I was overreacting. But then I remembered the unfamiliar number on our call logs, the frequent calls, the way she dressed up the night before. The doubt settled back in, heavier than before. The weekend crept by, and Laura seemed more distant than ever. She spent a lot of time on her phone, messaging quietly or disappearing into the bedroom to take calls. I could feel the cracks widening between us, our once solid foundation of trust beginning to crumble. By Sunday night, I knew I couldn't just sit by and ignore it. I needed answers. I waited until she was asleep before slipping out of bed and heading to the living room, where her handbag was resting on the coffee table. I reached in, careful not to make any noise, and pulled out her phone. She'd recently changed her password, something I'd thought odd but hadn't questioned at the time. Now, it felt like a warning sign. Fortunately, she was a creature of habit, and it didn't take long for me to guess the combination, a variation of our daughter's birthdate. I opened her messages, scrolling quickly through the chats, looking for the number I'd found on our phone bill. My heart hammered as I came across it under the name Dave. The conversation was recent, and as I scrolled back, I saw that it had started innocently enough, questions about work, shared jokes, compliments. But as the months went by, the messages grew more personal, more flirtatious, until they bordered on outright confessions of attraction. My hands shook as I read their exchanges, a nauseating mixture of anger and betrayal filling me. She had told him things she'd never told me, shared jokes and secrets that I hadn't heard before. It was like she was a different person with him, someone carefree and uninhibited, someone I barely recognized. It hurt more than I could have imagined, seeing her talk to another man in ways she used to talk to me. I put the phone back and sat down on the couch, my mind racing. Confronting her then and there would have been easy, but I knew it wouldn't give me the answers I needed. This affair was more than just flirtatious messages. She was emotionally invested in him. I needed to know how deep it went. The next day, I took a personal day from work. I'd never considered snooping or digging into my wife's private life, but now I felt justified. If Laura was going to play me for a fool, I'd make sure I wasn't one when I finally confronted her. I spent the morning researching private investigators, finding one with solid reviews and a discreet reputation. By noon, I was sitting across from a man named Frank in a small, dimly lit office tucked away in a nondescript building downtown. Frank was a quiet, unassuming guy with a balding head and a penchant for listening more than talking, which suited me just fine. "I need proof," I told him, keeping my voice steady. "Photos, locations, dates, everything you can find." He nodded, making notes on a small pad of paper. "You want the full report?" "Yeah. I want to know who this guy is and what's been going on between them." I can't go on just suspecting. Frank looked at me thoughtfully. This isn't the first time I've had a case like this, he said quietly. I know it's tough, but sometimes it's better to have the truth, no matter how hard it is to hear. I swallowed hard, his words sinking in. Did I really want the truth? Would knowing the extent of her betrayal make it easier or harder to move forward? But deep down, I knew I couldn't go back to the way things were. I needed to know. So, I gave Frank the details and left the office, a sense of dread settling over me as I walked back to my car. The next few days were a blur. I went through the motions at work, trying to focus, but my mind kept drifting back to Frank and what he might uncover. I kept my distance from Laura, barely engaging in conversation, and she seemed relieved, as if my indifference allowed her to live her double life without guilt. Each evening, she'd disappear for an hour or two, claiming to go for a run or to the gym, but now I knew better. Finally, a week later, Frank called. His voice was calm, but I could hear the tension in his words. I've got something for you. Do you want to come in? I took a deep breath. Yeah. I'll be there in an hour. When I arrived at Frank's office, he handed me a thick envelope. Everything's in there. I'd suggest reading it somewhere private. Thanks, Frank, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I felt numb, like I was floating outside my own body, watching this scene unfold from a distance. I drove to a nearby park, finding an empty bench under a tree, away from the noise of the city. My hands shook as I opened the envelope and pulled out the photos. There she was, Laura, holding hands with Dave, laughing, looking at him with an affection I hadn't seen in months. They were at a small cafe, their faces close as they talked, oblivious to the world around them. I flipped through the photos, each one a stab to the heart, each one confirming my worst fears. The report detailed their meetings, the dates and locations, the messages exchanged. It was all laid out in brutal, unforgiving detail. I read about the times she'd lied to me, the excuses she'd given, the careful planning that had gone into hiding her affair. My world, once secure and predictable, had been torn apart, and there was no going back. For a long time, I just sat there, the weight of it all pressing down on me. I thought about confronting her, about the things I would say, the accusations I would hurl. But as the anger simmered, a strange sense of calm settled over me. Confronting her might bring temporary satisfaction, but it wouldn't change what had happened. It wouldn't erase the betrayal or mend the cracks in our relationship. No, I realized, if she wanted to betray me, she could live with the consequences. I'd take control in a way she'd never expect. There would be no yelling, no accusations, no begging. I would deal with this in my own way, and when I was ready, I'd make sure she knew exactly what she'd lost. For now, though, I put the photos and the report back in the envelope, tucking it into my jacket. I had what I needed. I had the truth. And soon, Laura would learn the price of her lies. I held on to the evidence for another few days, tucking it away in my desk drawer under a pile of old bills and paperwork. It felt heavy, like a secret that threatened to explode every time I looked at it. Laura, of course, was oblivious, going about her daily routine with a casualness that made my anger simmer under the surface. She had no idea what I knew, and part of me savored the thought of what was to come. I decided to wait until the end of the week to set my plan in motion. I wanted to make sure I had everything in place, that every detail was airtight. When Friday rolled around, I watched Laura get dressed up again, her hair styled, her makeup flawless. She was practically glowing, but to me, her beauty was a facade, a mask that hid the betrayal beneath. I'll probably be back late again, she said with a casual shrug as she picked up her purse, flashing me that same practiced smile she'd used the previous week. No problem, I replied, forcing myself to sound indifferent. Have a good time. She looked at me a little longer than usual, perhaps noticing the slight edge in my tone, but then she nodded and left, the front door closing softly behind her. I waited until I heard her car pull away before I moved. I'd already packed an overnight bag and prepared everything I needed. The first stop was at our bank. I'd set up a meeting with a financial advisor earlier in the week, ensuring that everything we shared was prepared for a swift division. Our joint accounts, the mortgage, even the kids' college funds. I knew Laura was financially comfortable, but I wanted to make sure I secured what I could for the kids and myself before things got ugly. I signed papers, set aside funds, and ensured that by the end of the day, half of our shared assets would be transferred to a new account in my name. Next, I met with the family lawyer I'd retained earlier that week. Laura and I had discussed a prenuptial agreement before we married, but we never followed through, trusting in each other's love and integrity. I felt a bitter laugh bubble up at the irony as I reviewed the final draft of our divorce filing. The lawyer went over the terms again, noting the custody arrangements I'd requested, the division of assets, and, finally, the grounds for divorce: infidelity. Each line felt like a piece of closure, like a way to put an end to the life I'd built with someone who had deceived me so completely. When I'd signed the papers, I glanced at my watch. It was late afternoon, and I had just enough time to make my last stop before heading home. I drove to the office of a locksmith, a quiet, unassuming shop in a strip mall. I handed over the house keys, requesting that the locks be changed by morning. The locksmith gave me a sympathetic look as he took them, and I wondered how many others he'd seen walking through his door with similar tales of broken trust. By the time I got back home, the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood. I stood in the doorway of the living room, staring at the familiar furniture, the family photos, the small knickknacks that Laura had chosen to decorate our home. It all felt surreal, like I was standing on the edge of two worlds, one where I still loved and trusted her, and another where I was about to sever her from my life forever. I poured myself a glass of whiskey and sat down in the armchair by the window, waiting for her return. The house was silent, the ticking of the clock the only sound, each tick reminding me of the hours I'd wasted, the love I'd squandered on someone who hadn't valued it. I tried to feel sadness, but all I felt was anger, sharp, hot, and relentless. It wasn't just the betrayal that cut deep, it was the casualness with which she'd lied to me, the way she'd assumed she could live this double life without consequences. Around midnight, I heard her car pull into the driveway. I didn't move, watching her shadow pass by the window before the front door creaked open. She tiptoed inside, as if sneaking in would somehow erase the infidelity written all over her face. "Hey," she whispered, surprised to see me still awake. "You're up late." I took a sip of my drink, watching her over the rim of the glass. "Couldn't sleep." She looked at me warily, sensing the tension in the room. "Is everything okay?" "Depends," I replied evenly, setting the glass down on the table. "Do you want to tell me where you've really been?" Her eyes widened for a split second before she caught herself, forcing a smile. "I told you, just out with some friends." "Right," I said, reaching for the envelope on the table beside me. I pulled out one of the photos Frank had taken, the one of her and Dave at the cafe, laughing as if they were the only two people in the world. "Is this one of your friends?" She froze, staring at the photo, her face paling as the reality of the situation hit her. I can explain," she stammered, taking a step back, as if she could retreat from the truth. "Explain." I felt the anger rise again, but I kept my voice steady. "Explain how you've been lying to me for months. How you've been sneaking around, pretending to be the loving wife while you were with him." Tears filled her eyes, and for a moment, I felt a pang of the old affection, the urge to comfort her. But it passed as quickly as it came, replaced by a cold resolve. "I never wanted to hurt you," she whispered, her voice shaking. "It just happened. I was lonely, Anne." "Lonely?" I snapped, unable to keep the bitterness from my tone. "You could have talked to me, Laura. You could have told me how you felt. But instead, you chose this." She looked down, her hands trembling as she tried to compose herself. "I'm sorry. I'll end it. I promise. I shook my head, the finality of my decision settling over me. It's too late for that. I've already spoken to a lawyer. The divorce papers are ready. You'll get them tomorrow. She gasped, the realization hitting her like a punch. Divorce? No, please, we can work through this. For the kids, we can. For the kids? I interrupted, the hypocrisy of her words almost laughable. You threw away this marriage, Laura. You made your choice. Now you'll have to live with it. She opened her mouth to protest, but I held up a hand, silencing her. I've already made arrangements. I've moved half of our funds into a separate account for me and the kids. I'm changing the locks tomorrow. You'll have until the weekend to gather your things and find somewhere else to stay. She broke down then, sobbing openly, her shoulders shaking as she tried to reach out to me. Please, don't do this. I love you, I made a mistake, but I love you. I stared at her, the words empty and hollow in my ears. Whatever love had existed between us had withered, strangled by her lies. I stood up, walking to the door, my voice cold and detached. Good night, Laura. I suggest you get some rest. And with that, I left her alone in the living room, her quiet sobs echoing in the darkness. I slept restlessly that night, haunted by memories of the life Laura and I had built together. The anger I'd felt in her presence started to dissipate as the hours passed, leaving a hollow ache in its place. I'd made my choice, set my course, and now, standing on the edge of a new chapter, I felt less triumphant than I had imagined. The evidence of her betrayal lay neatly in that envelope, yet the satisfaction of catching her, of delivering my ultimatum, didn't bring the closure I'd thought it would. The next morning, I was awakened by the sound of Laura moving around the house, packing up a few things into a suitcase. She moved quietly, her usual morning energy subdued, each of her footsteps heavy with the finality of the decision I'd forced her to face. I stayed in bed, listening to the sounds of her departure, wondering if I was supposed to feel anything beyond the aching emptiness. Later, when I came downstairs, the house felt eerie, like the heart of it had been hollowed out. Laura had left a note on the kitchen counter, the handwriting shaky and tentative. I'm sorry for everything. I'll pick up the rest of my things this weekend. I stared at the words, waiting for anger or relief to rise, but neither came. Just a gnawing emptiness that settled deeper into my chest. The kids came home from school in the afternoon, their chatter filling the silence as they went about their routines. They didn't know anything yet. I'd decided to wait until Laura and I had figured out a schedule before breaking the news. I wanted it to be as painless as possible for them. They deserved that much. The next couple of days passed in a fog. I kept up appearances at work, avoided neighbors' questions about Laura's absence, and maintained my usual routine for the kids. But I could feel the weight of my own decision pressing on me, the reality of a life spent alone unfolding in ways I hadn't foreseen. I thought of her constantly, despite the betrayal, despite the hurt, and wondered if this would ever get easier. But the worst of it was the nights, empty and heavy, haunted by echoes of her laughter, the faint memory of her warmth beside me. Finally, Saturday arrived. Laura was due to pick up the rest of her things in the afternoon, and the kids would be out with their grandparents, sparing them from what would no doubt be a difficult encounter. I spent the morning packing a few things of hers into boxes, leaving them neatly by the front door. Every item felt like a memory I was burying, a reminder of the life we'd shared and the pieces of it I was now choosing to discard. Around 2 in the afternoon, the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Laura standing there, her eyes puffy and rimmed red, her usual confident demeanor replaced by a fragile uncertainty. "Hi," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hi," I replied, stepping aside to let her in. She moved past me, her eyes lingering on the boxes by the door before she turned to face me. For a long moment, we stood there in silence, the weight of everything unspoken pressing between us. "I know I have no right to ask," she finally said, her voice breaking. But I just wanted you to know, if I could go back and undo everything, I would. I looked at her, the raw regret in her eyes bringing back a rush of memories, the good times, the laughter, the moments that had defined us. Why did you do it, Laura? I asked, my voice barely containing the hurt I'd kept buried. She swallowed hard, tears brimming in her eyes. I don't know. I guess I was looking for something I thought I'd lost. But I was wrong. I had everything I needed right here. She paused, her voice breaking. I just didn't realize it until it was too late. I turned away, unable to meet her gaze, her words cutting deeper than I'd anticipated. You should go, I managed, my voice strained. She nodded, and we stood there in a painful silence, the finality of it settling over us like a shroud. She reached for the boxes, stacking them by the door, and we moved through the motions like strangers, burdened by a shared history neither of us knew how to reconcile. As she lifted the last box, a photograph fell from between the pages of an old album. It was of us, taken years ago on a family trip to the beach, both of us laughing, carefree, holding our children close. Laura picked it up, staring at it with a soft smile, her fingers brushing over the image. For a brief, painful moment, she looked up at me. We had something good, didn't we? Yes, I whispered, the word catching in my throat. We did. She nodded, slipping the photo back between the pages before closing the box. With one last look, she took a deep breath and turned toward the door. Goodbye, James. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. I watched as she walked away, her figure disappearing down the driveway, until I was left standing in the doorway, the emptiness consuming me. Days passed, and life fell into a hollow rhythm. The kids adapted to the new arrangement, asking questions I wasn't prepared to answer, and I did my best to give them the love and stability they deserved. But at night, alone in the quiet of the house, the weight of my decision lingered, haunting me with echoes of a life I could never return to. Then, one evening, the phone rang. It was late, the kids were asleep, and I was sitting alone in the dimly lit living room. I picked up, expecting a telemarketer or a wrong number. James. Her voice was barely a whisper, soft and fragile. It was Laura. Laura. I replied, my pulse quickening at the sound of her voice. There was a pause, and then a shaky breath. I don't know who else to call. I just wanted to hear your voice. A pang of sadness washed over me, and I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tighter. Are you okay? I asked softly, my voice laced with concern. No, she whispered, her voice breaking. I'm not. I sat there in silence, the reality of her words settling over me. Do you need help? No, she replied, her voice barely audible. I just wanted you to know, that I'm sorry. For everything. And that I never stopped loving you. A heavy silence fell between us, each of us lost in the weight of what we'd lost, of the love that had once been so vibrant and real. Goodbye, James, she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. And then the line went dead, the finality of her words echoing in the silence of the room. I sat there, the phone slipping from my grasp, a sense of loss washing over me. The next morning, I received the call. Laura had been found in her apartment, alone, a mix of alcohol and pills beside her bed. I sat on the edge of the bed, the shock numbing me as the officer on the other end explained the details. I could barely hear him, my mind reeling, my heart breaking as I tried to grasp the reality of it. I never got to say goodbye. I never got to tell her that, despite everything, I still loved her too. Now, she was gone, and all I was left with were the memories, fragments of a life that could never be mended. The house felt emptier than ever, the kids' laughter a stark contrast to the grief that now filled every corner. Each night, as I lay alone, I realized the true cost of truth, the price of a broken heart. I had set out for revenge, for justice, but in the end, I'd lost something far more precious. All I had left was a photograph, a memory of laughter and love, of the life we'd once shared and the life we'd never get back. And as I sat there, staring at that image, I finally understood the depths of my regret, the unspoken words that would haunt me for the rest of my life.